It's a capacity increasing program, not the content. And that is why this program was supported historically, both from the left and from the right. Because from the left, you can see the emancipatory power of increasing these capacities. But from the right side, you can talk about this in terms of character and virtue development.
Welcome to another episode of the Name It podcast. I am your host, Jonas Oganovsky. This podcast is all about exploring and naming the deeper meanings, metaphors, and insights underneath our guests' passions, projects, and professions. I sit down with people from all walks of life to find out what brings them alive. This is part 2 of a 2-part episode with Tomas Björkman, where we dive further into the inner development goals and how they relate to education and a number of other topics.
Even if you might not, like I do, believe that we are facing a very deep societal transformation, at least everyone would agree with me that the technological development that we see now is so rapid and transformative that we can really not have any idea about what practical skills or what trades we should educate young people into. I mean, I think we can for sure say that we will not need any programmers 10 years from now. Even 5 years from now, programming will be done completely by artificial intelligence. I don't think we will have any accountants. I think very few lawyers. At least all contract work and even contract negotiation might be done between AIs. We will need people who care for each other. So I certainly think there will be a lot of need for nurses, but perhaps not for doctors. Coming up with a diagnosis from MRI or X-ray will certainly be done by artificial intelligence just in a few years, to the extent it's not already done. And in such an educational environment, then of course the question will be, what do we need to concentrate on? And certainly basic skills like reading and writing and arithmetic, we will always need that. We will need to be able to learn to use our language and all of that. But on top of that, I think that the skills we need to teach is very much skills how to learn and to be constantly able to relearn and to reskill yourself throughout life. And then on top of that, there are some fundamental human skills that we all need to develop. And that was really the starting point for this project that you were mentioning, the inner development goals. That took as its starting points the fact that we are not moving towards the sustainable development goals fast enough. And taking as a premise that these shifts that we need to see in the outer world, that is expressed, for example, in the sustainable development goals, that those problems are not just located out there. Part of those problems are located within us humans. And part of the problem is that we do not have the psychological, both cognitive and emotional skills and capacities to really be able to engage with these almost existential problems. And as humans, when we are facing problems that are so daunting to us that we cannot even engage with them, then we develop very naturally psychological defenses. like denial or rationalization. And the starting point for the project was really asking the question, what human inner capacities do we all need to develop in order for us to be able collectively to move closer to realizing the sustainable development goals, for example? Or another way to express it, to really have the capacity as individuals and as collective in a democracy to be able to engage with existential threats that are that humanity is facing. And that was the starting point. And that was some years ago. And then we had more than 1,000 people from various backgrounds, from the environmental movement, but also coaches and psychologists and other from wisdom traditions, give their input to this. And then we had a group of scientists and researchers in different fields, but not the least in the psychological field of adult developmental theory, psychologists who are interested in trying to understand how our mind develops, not just through our childhood and adolescence, but how our mind can continue to develop and grow capacities throughout life. To boil all of this input down to a framework that we call the inner development goals. It's a play on the, of course, on the sustainable development goals.
I think it's,
The name
I remember seeing the inner development goals, and it was like this, this relief and sort of like a refreshing, trying to think of a metaphor, like a refreshing tall glass of water of just having worked within psychology and addiction and community development for over a decade, and just often getting a real sense of how important inner development is. And as you said at the beginning of the podcast, the social or cultural conversation and the awareness has only just recently started to occur, to see that there was not the only one out there, but a decent framework and a language and work happening towards building some momentum in that direction was just such a good relief. Sorry, I had to kind of interject there.
No, yeah, and I think that's, I mean, it's a fairly crude framework, and it's still under development. It's going through a major revision at the moment, and I hope that this will constantly be a work in progress. But so far we have identified 23 skills and qualities, and grouped them into 5 dimensions or domains, where the first one is about being, and that is about relationship to self. The second one is about thinking, that's cognitive skills. The third dimension is relating, that's caring for others and for the world. The fourth is collaborating. You can call that social skills. And then finally, the 5th dimension is acting. It's enabling change. And the skills and qualities that we have identified in each of these categories are such that science clearly show that it is possible to develop these skills. So, for example, in the category of relating, we have the skill and quality of compassion. And science clearly showed that you are not born with a certain amount of compassion. You can actively develop your capacity for compassion, both in the way that you can deepen your ability, but you can also extend it to larger and larger groups of people, and even perhaps beyond humanity onto to nature and to all living beings. So just to give you some examples of skills in the various dimensions. So in the being dimension, we are talking about the need to connect with your inner compass, develop integrity and authenticity, developing a learning and open mindset, your self-awareness, and your capacity to be presence. In the thinking dimension, or the cognitive skills, we're talking about developing your capacity for critical thinking, complexity awareness, perspective skills, being able to take other people's perspective, but also see a question from many different perspectives, and perhaps using complementary epistemologies, not only being stuck in, as we said before, in this natural science perspective, but be open to other perspectives as well. Develop your ability for sense making and to long-term orientation and visioning. In relating, we have appreciation, connectedness, humility, empathy, and compassion. In collaborating, we have communication skills, co-creation skills, inclusive mindsets and intercultural competences, trust and mobilization skills. And finally, when it comes to acting, we have skills like courage, creativity, optimism, and perseverance. And again, the good news is that science clearly shows that we are able to develop these capacities. That's the good news. The slightly more challenging news is that we cannot teach these skills in a traditional school setting.
Yes.
Not at least as the school settings are today. So developing these skills require that we access deeper psychological processes, and some educational thinkers call the type of learning that we need to engage with some sort of immersive or transformative learning. But that is possible, and one of the works that are going on right now within the framework of this project is to start to develop a database of what interventions have been scientifically and educationally proven to really support the development of these capacities.
That's really
And of course, one should say that these capacities cannot be developed in isolation. They are all interconnected and depending on each other. So most pedagogical approaches are developing clusters of these capacities. One should also say that it's important to remember, and I like the name of the project, Inner Development Goals, because it points towards the Sustainable Development Goals and to the fact that we are not just advocating inner development for the benefit of the individual, but that this is ultimately also for the benefit of the society and for the planet. It is for a greater good. But the name might be a little bit unluckily chosen, because if we take the three words inner, it's very important to remember that inner does not mean individual. The inner development is, as we all already mentioned, yes, it's certainly in the individual, but it's also intersubjectively. It's also in the culture. So the inner development is both individual, but also collective. And it's most difficult for us today, in today's society, to see the collective component of that. So that was inner. Development, some people might get the connotations that this is another modernistic project, and we believe that this is a sort of a linear process, easily developed, and it's
I think that's a good one to speak to in terms of how you might respond to that kind of a understandable
response. So we have this connotation with development, but this process is much more organic. So you might talk about perhaps instead of development, flourishing or something like that, to realize that it is not something that you can really project manage and expect, but rather you can cultivate like a garden that you can make flourish. So
yes,
development is perhaps not a perfect word here, and nor is, of course, goals, because some people would say that, well, goals, that's very instrumental, and can you measure these things, and yeah, all of this. And we do not use the goals here as something that should necessarily be achieved or be measured, but more as goals, as in aspiration, something to aspire towards. But with all those caveats, we are very happy in the way that this project has resonated with the world, and we've been surprised how very rapidly, just over the last 2 years, almost with very little effort from the project, over 300 local hubs have sprung up all over the world. Of course, mostly in Europe and in North America, but many in South America, some in Africa, many in Asia, Japan. We have many hubs. Even in China, we have five hubs today. So there has been a lot of resonance, and it might be exactly as you pointed out, that there are so many people who has felt that we have been missing the inner aspects in these outer challenges, but we haven't really had a good language to express these concerns. And hopefully the development goals could provide at least a first draft of a common language that can help us to bring this on the political agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm aware of time. I also know that we lost a few minutes there. Are you okay for us to go a little bit longer, or?
Yes, we can. We can. Yeah.
I'd love for us to perhaps ground this a little bit in perhaps maybe an example of what actually occurs in some of the workshops and the retreats that do run via that the
Ekskäret Foundation. Ekskäret Foundation. Yes, yes. And in many other places. I mean, this is nothing new. This is nothing new. And as I said,
one of your books talks about in the Nordic Secret.
I encountered this 20 years ago in business. So in business and leadership consultants, people have been doing this for decades. And of course, in religious and spiritual traditions, not only in Buddhist tradition, but in many spiritual traditions, a focus on the importance of inner growth and development has been at the center of those pursuits. Also in various indigenous cultures, of course. It is really just in our Western Enlightenment industrial culture where we have sort of completely neglected the inner dimension, and
we've had to find our way back via almost a commodified version of a workshop where it's humans coming together and reflecting and coming back home to it
and working on this. And of course, in this more contemporary style in workshops, this has been going on everywhere in the Western world for at least the last 50 years. And one example there, of course, is the work that has been going on in the SLN Institute in California, which was a very important center for the human potential movement, and where many contemporary techniques for working on our inner development, such as Gestalt therapy or the FIRO concept were developed, and that concepts like that has been refined again and again. So there are many good Western contemporary techniques to complement the more traditional indigenous or spiritual approaches to inner development. And I'll go. And it's also interesting to see how scientific research in this area is picking up, and more articles are coming out that in a scientific way shows that many of these tools and techniques that have been employed, some of them for thousands of years, actually work on these dimensions.
Which brings me to maybe a two-part question, or two questions that I have just in relation to these examples, which might be, or in the case that you've got some involvement with actual workshops or sort of specific containers that are created and held by an organization or some facilitators. The first question is perhaps a brief summary of what actually occurs, or what kinds of, we might call it education, but what kinds of learning or what kinds of immersion or experience forms these workshops.
Yeah, as we heard when I went through the different dimensions of the inner development goals, there are many different aspects of this inner work. But if I should try to summarize, perhaps one of the most important is that, and that is really part of this lifelong maturation journey, and that is helping people to get access to more of themselves, to be able to see more aspects of themselves, and to be able to see more aspects of the world and relationships and everything. And again, this sounds abstract. I can take two concrete examples. If you have a young child that gets angry, then the anger has the child. The child has no possibility to relate to its anger. So the anger has the child. Whereas when you grow up, at some point, and certainly as an adult, we can hope that when we get angry, we can have a view on our anger and say, hey, now I'm starting to get angry. What should I do with my anger? And sometimes it's more wise to put it aside. And sometimes you might even decide that you need to act it out in some appropriate way. But you could say that you have your anger. It's not the anger having you.
Okay? Yeah, I think
and in the
Robert
same
Keegan
way,
refers to that as
the subject-object move that. And this can happen in so many different ways in these different skills. So if we just take one step up there in age, I had the opportunity to, in one of the youth camps that we have been running at the Ekskäret Foundation on our island out in the archipelago, for adolescents, I overheard a conversation between one of the young participants. She might have been 15 years old or 14 years old or something like that, and one of the little bit older youth leaders. And she expressed her concern about being so busy and wanting to do so many things and filling her life with so many things that she became overwhelmed and completely frustrated. And then the older adolescent or young adult said something to her and asked some questions. And interestingly enough, he was not trained in any way. He was not a psychologist, of course, or anything, but just in the interhuman, open, vulnerable dialogue that was going on. He said something, and then something happened in her. And she said, "Wow, so you mean that I do not have to do all the things I want to do?" And for the first time, that sort of her will did not have her, but she could take a view on the will and say, yes, I want to do all of these things, but I don't need to do that. I can decide. Okay. So that was a very important sort of developmental step. And going even older, many adults are completely stuck in their worldview and starting to realize that the worldview is not something that has you, but you have the worldview, and you can adopt a different worldview, and you can keep many worldviews and use different worldviews to see a problem from many different perspectives.
Yeah.
And in each of these steps, whether it's the young child with the anger, the adolescent with the will, or an adult with the worldview, taking this developmental step, of course, increases your freedom. Instead of the anger having you, you can make decisions. Instead of the will having you, you can make decisions. Instead of being fixed in a worldview, you can actually choose to employ many different worldviews. And that gives you a greater and greater freedom. And that gives you also then, of course, cognitive, but also in some of these cases, a more emotional capacity to live a richer life and to be able to contribute more to the world and to society.
Yeah, and I think that's it sounds like there's a bit of an intersection between the environment that is aimed at that's sort of fostered as best as possible by the people who are running those workshops and holding that space over that period of time, and those people, whether they be young people in this case, being at a point in their life in that moment to organically have that potentially that shift in perspective, or that becoming aware of and making an object of something that previously held them, I'm going to say, captive in a way to a narrower sense of self. And one of the things, and then I'm just reminding myself to kind of link to the other question. One of the questions I kept sort of coming to when I was sort of researching some of the organizations and the work that you were doing, and similar ones, was the I'm going to say tension, or the polarity between we recognize that, and science is showing as well, it's that there are many tipping points and global level challenges that are on the horizon, and that there's a bit of an urgency for us to collectively and individually meet those challenges. And so there's that inner impulse and agency, that responsibility that we could take in to meet the moment, and utilizing that agency, facilitating others' growth, engaging in our own development and growth. So there's that agency, that the choosing. And then I think you mentioned at the beginning, you acknowledged this in a way, which was that when it comes to natural systems and culture and human beings, there's an organic side to that, and there's not really a certainty that we can have of what the future will hold, or even what the apparent ingredients are that will take us in the best direction. And yet we must do the best we can.
Yeah,
and
yes. And I would even make the stronger argument that I believe that this development that we see now, this transition, that by necessity will have to be emergent, meaning that not even theoretically can it be possible for us to foresee what is coming out on the other side. It will be something completely new. And this transition being emergent also then, of course, means that we cannot plan it and we cannot manage it. But I think that we can still increase the odds of this bifurcation point that we are reaching, that it will be possible for humanity to have a breakthrough rather than a breakdown. And one of them, not the only, but one necessary thing that we need to do in order to increase the odds for a breakthrough rather than a breakdown is to increase our awareness. Or, speaking in the language of the IDGs, to develop the cognitive and emotional capacities to be able to both functions as creators of that future as it emerges, but also being able to have the capacity to function in such a world, because such a world will, even though it might be a more elegant world than today, it will also be a more complex world. So it will be more psychologically and emotionally demanding.
Yes, it brings to mind.
And I should,
and
I just want to finish by connecting this to you. Just mention briefly the book, The Nordic Secret.
Yes.
To just mention that we in the Scandinavian countries, we went through this very turbulent transition from being the poorest non-democratic agrarian societies at the end of the 1800s to just a few generations later being the most stable, richest, happiest industrial democracies in the world. And that was a transition that took place just during a few generations from the end of the 1800s to even before the Second World War. And this did not happen by chance. And I had the pleasure to work with my friend and colleague, the Danish author and philosopher Lene Andersen, who put in a wonderful job in, together with me, writing the book, The Nordic Secret, where we unpack the history behind this transition. And it turns out that at the end of the 1800s, when again these countries were dirt poor, 30% of Sweden's working population emigrated mainly to the US just to get out of the hardships. But back then we had some very talented both intellectuals and politicians in the Nordic countries who knew that in times of rapid societal transition, a similar transition that we are facing right now, that in those times it's just so easy for us humans to want to have an external authority to hold on to, like a dogmatic religion or an authoritarian leader. an Erdogan or a Trump. But these intellectuals and politicians, they didn't want to be authoritarian leaders. They were firmly committed to building democracy. But they knew that it's more psychologically and emotionally demanding to live in a democracy, and certainly to be co-creators of a democratic society, than just taking orders from an authoritarian leaders. So what they wanted to do was to help many people from many different walks of life to develop those inner capacities necessary to be able to be creative and conscious co-creators of the emerging democratic society. And the way they went about to do it is quite astonishing, because what they did was that they created what could best today be described as retreat centers out in nature. So they created small SLNs or small Ekskäret or whatever you would call it. And by the turn of the last century, year 1900, there were 100 centers like this just in Denmark, 75 in Norway, and 150 in Sweden, where later on, young adults in their early 20s could spend up to 6 months in retreat, later on with full state subsidy, with the expressed aim of taking this very important developmental step of going from being outer directed, having an outer locus of control, being dependent on an outside authority, to become inner directed, to connect with their own inner compass, and in that way be able to, without external guidance, navigate a turbulent societal transition. And I don't think that this what took place in the Scandinavian countries 150 to 100 years ago. And I should say that almost exactly 100 years ago, this program was at its height. And then 10% of each young generation participated in one of these 6 months programs. And of course, that created what we today would call a critical mass or a tipping point in society, especially since these 10% did not come from any particular part of society, but from very many different parts. Many had farming background, working class background, but also middle class and intellectual background. So what I was going to say is that I don't believe that what we did in Scandinavia back then should serve as a blueprint for what we should do today. But I do think that this represents a very interesting case study, showing that a massive support of developing these inner skills and capacities, or you might use the language of consciousness development, that the broad efforts of societal increase of consciousness can actually shift societies at large scale, and that happened at full scale in 4 Nordic countries in a little bit different way, in Denmark, Norway, Finland, and later on, Sweden, and then a little bit later on, Finland. But today we might use retreat centers, certainly, but they do not scale easily. It's still very expensive. So that is one of the initiatives in our ecosystem, which is called 29K, or AWARE, is focusing on looking into the possibility of creating a non-profit open source digital platform that can help people at least start on this inner developmental journey completely free of charge, and where the authentic meeting, and in that case it's authentic video meetings in small groups, is sort of the secret sauce that makes this happen.
And I think it's great that you've mentioned that they were good case studies that can inform current and future sort of new innovations and
it's so easy to think that, well, talking about supporting inner growth and in the development of concepts, that is some new age idea. Idealistic new age idea will never work. No, it did work full scale. Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden.
Yes, I did have a little inner voice wanting to ask the question of, how would, it's not actually a question. I think I have to own the fact that it's probably just a reflection, which is in current times, depending on the culture and the political environment of where it was, suggested that would be an approach to have a sort of a partially or fully state-funded program like that. You'd probably get some people being anywhere from skeptical to pessimistic or even suspicious about such an approach. And I imagine, without having heard the details, it would be important for it to be not what is taught, that there's like a sort of a strict content of here's what all of our young people will learn, but it's more of how to explore yourself, how to think, as opposed to what to think would be a
absolutely. It's increasing your capacity to think and to feel. It's a capacity increasing program, not the content. And that is why this program was supported historically, both from the left and from the right. Because from the left you can see the emancipatory power of increasing these capacities, but from the right side you can talk about this in terms of character and virtue development. And that has, from a conservative side, always been an important part for people to be able to take responsibility for their own lives, not being dependent on the state. You need to develop these sort of inner capacities, virtues, and character in order to take responsibility for your own life. So whether you come from a more emancipatory perspective or a more empowering the individual perspective, increasing your capacities for this can only be good. And also from a political propaganda point of view, the only ones that would not sort of buy into these programs are the authoritarians, who really want people to be ignorant and dependent on them. But otherwise, I mean, any serious politician would say that I'd rather speak to an informed audience that has got agency than someone who is just looking for an authoritarian leader.
Yes, I really appreciate your willingness to sort of, explore the work and the concepts from different angles. It's I find that really important, and I am, speaking of learning and education, I find myself learning so much from the people that I speak to and have on the podcast. I have one more question that I wanted to ask, just in relation to that, before we slowly wind up the episode, because I really appreciate your time that you've given. And that is, we mentioned briefly, and I'll put the resources and your books in the show notes, but we also mentioned a developmental theorist. I think we kind of glossed over it, but we may not have sort of mentioned to the listeners a little bit more about the background of the approach. And that was Robert Kegan's, and Lisa Leahy, I think is her name, out of Harvard School of Education. And some of the work that underpins what some of those your organizations are working on. And I'm curious, when it comes to the growth that some of the young people, the participants might go through, how have you found when they come out of those, whether they've shifted? Is that something that you sort of allow to just happen organically, and the groups go through year to year, or do you actually have interviews and conversations with them to gain they're sort of at this developmental stage of development at this point, and then when they leave?
I think that my approach and our approach in the development goals is more to say that inner growth and development is an extremely complex journey. It's culturally embedded, but ultimately also an individual journey, and we all develop in different ways. And the best way we can do is to support the development in these different dimensions and these capacities. Then psychologists have and also spiritual traditions have always been very interested in the more transformative developmental aspects. And those sometimes happens. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they can happen quick. They can happen as a consequence of a significant life event, like you waking up at a hospital after your first heart attack and seriously questioning your life and priorities, and that might lead to a more significant or almost momentary shift in consciousness. And those shifts have always fascinated psychologists and also spiritual traditionals, these awakening moments. But I see them more as a curiosity and an add-on, and I think it's very difficult to try to facilitate those more rapid changes. But certainly when I look back over my life, I can't say that I have had any specific moments that was really shifting. But if I go back and look, and you might want to do the same, and listeners might want to do the same, look back 20 years and think, are you the same person like you were 20 years ago? Or 40 years ago? Or you might even compare yourself today. I might compare myself today with the person I was 20 years ago, and I might compare that person with a person 20 years earlier. And I could certainly say that, no, I didn't have any moment of awakening or transformation, but I am, to a large extent, a different person. And I think many people would agree that over life, we do fundamentally change. And then, of course, we realize that we are constantly in some sort of process as humans. And then we could ask ourselves, the change that we have gone through, is that in some respect for the better or for the worse? And we can hope that it is for the better. And in most people around me or people I come in contact with, I think one can see a positive life trajectory, becoming more aware or wiser, or having access to a greater part of ourselves. But that is not general. I have also examples in my vicinity where people get stuck and get even more stuck with time, and get angry and embittered and sad. And of course, a question that comes to me then, could that life have been developed differently? And how could the environment or even how could society, how could our culture have supported that individual to instead be on a positive life journey. And then we come to the concept, as you mentioned, Robert Keegan in his later work with the co-author you also named, that's called an everyone culture. There they are talking about, is it possible to create corporate cultures, they focus on, corporate cultures that deliberately support a positive developmental journey through life, and they call that a deliberately developmental organization.
Yeah.
And I would extend that line of arguing and say, could we even extend that to try to create a deliberately developmental society that at least tries to, is aware of this ongoing developmental process and has at least as an aim to try to be as supportive as possible of a positive life development. And I would say, and I would claim that the Scandinavian countries, not today, we have lost it completely. We started to lose it after the Second World War already. But 100 years ago, we were explicitly trying to create a deliberately developmental society where many aspects, not just education, but many functions in society and the societal culture would try to, in a very gentle way, but in an aware way, in a conscious way, support people to go through a positive rather than a negative life development journey.
Yeah. I really liked your response to my question about, essentially, measuring where are young people at before they start a workshop and what's shifted for them afterwards, not necessarily in a linear way. And what you responded with made me think it's putting at the forefront, not where are you at on some kind of arbitrary measure, but just being a human being and offering a space and a place and environment for them to be who they are, with some mentors or guidance or space to pause from their life and to go inwards and tap into and nurture the garden of themselves and their relationships. And so I really liked that angle.
And the same for adults. I mean, not pushing people in any way or demanding anything or whatever, but as I said, you can see, and if you think in your environment, you can see, especially sadly, people in the second half of our lives, many luckily go on some sort of positive developmental wisdom journey, but too many people in our society today go in the other direction. And of course, if we could have a society that increases the odds of us flourishing throughout our lives rather than becoming angry and bitter at ourselves and the world, that would be a contribution to humanity, at least according to my measures.
Yes. And so for some parting reflections, we're starting with challenge and then finishing with hope. What's in the work, the vision, the things that have driven you in your life and in these domains that we've spoken about? What's something that you see in this moment that is a particular challenge that you see? That's a very broad question, but that could be whether it's in the awareness raising or if it's in the economics side or the political side.
I can give you both the positive and the negative and the positive at the same time. I mean, the challenge is that we have a society today and a societal culture and institutions. I mean, can just mention generally the consumer mentality, the consumer market, and the social media and environment. Both of those, I would argue, effectively hinders a positive growth and development. And we see that the effects of that on democracy today. And I don't see that shifting anytime soon. So on one scale, you have a vast majority in our societies today where you see a development in the opposite direction. It is not an increasing awareness or consciousness. It's a decrease in that. And that we can see how that has effects on our democracies. That's the challenge. The positive side is that perhaps due to these sad events that we have experienced during the last couple of years with Brexit and Trump and the pandemic and the storming of the Capitol and the war of aggression in Europe, I can at the same time see a rapid awakening. It is still very, very small. So it's just some percentage of the population. So it is not yet strong enough to be the basis of some political movement or something, and it's not even large enough for traditional mass media to even bother about it. But it is rapidly expanding. So I would say that this very small segment is today 10 times larger than it was 5 years ago. So these ideas that we are talking about today, I would argue 5 years ago in the Western world would find a very, very, very small audience. Agreed. Today the audience is much bigger. It's still small in relatively term, but in absolute term, if you look at Sweden, I mean, we say that I would suggest that today at least 2% of the population in Sweden would find what we are talking about very interesting and resonating. And in the small country of Sweden with 10 million people, that's 200,000 people. And I would guess that out of those 200,000 people, 50,000 would be in around Greater Stockholm. So how can we find each other? How can we start to talk about each other? And how can we start to bring even more people into these ways of thinking and seeing the world? That is for me where I can see hope today, that is happening. The big question is, of course, if this small but rapid awakening that's happening will be quick enough to stop the landslide on the other side. I mean, that's the
horse race
$1 million question.
Yeah, that is another question, another conversation. I really appreciate the time that you've given and the presence that you've given us and the listeners for the last couple of hours. Is there a place that you could point to that I'll definitely include in the show notes for anyone who's listening and is either, I'm curious, I want to know a bit more, or might want to really dive into some of this stuff?
Yeah. Some initiatives that I've been involved with that you could list is the YouTube channel Rebel Wisdom.
Yep.
The media platform whatisemerging.com. If you want to dive deeper into this thinking from a more philosophical academic perspective, I would recommend Perspectiva in London, Perspectiva Institute. Then we have already mentioned Lene's and my book, The Nordic Secret. We mentioned The World We Create. We could mention the book, The Market Myth. And then in a development goals project and the 29K/aware non-profit digital platform. That could be enough to start exploring this little ecosystem.
That's fantastic. I said it before, I'll say it again. Thank you so much, Tomas. Really appreciate your time, your work, your dedication, and I look forward to hearing and watching other rumblings out there in the ecosystem of the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed or learned from this episode, please subscribe and follow on wherever you listen to your podcasts so you never miss an episode.